Subliminal learning claims falsified. To begin this presentation, I will present you with what subliminal learning actually is. Subliminal learning is a method of subconsciously or unconsciously absorbing information. An example of a subliminal learning method would be to listen to an educational soundtrack while asleep. Although subliminal learning may work in some cases, one particular article by Alison Motlock on newscientist.com made an erroneous claim stating that listening to a foreign language at a low volume while asleep can improve a person's pronunciation, learning, and listening skills in that particular language. Mewes, Post, Scottle, and Lamb performed an experiment to determine whether consciousness or attention were necessary for learning. Two groups were created, a masking group for unconsciousness and an inattention group. Both were issued the same task to measure visual field bias and then to measure perceptual learning. The results were calculated through behavioral neural tests, and it was determined consciousness is absolutely necessary for learning. The article claiming that it is possible to learn foreign languages and improve pronunciations through subliminal learning is presenting false claims because subliminal learning is done unconsciously. The article claims that the person learns the language while he or she is sleeping, but the study deems consciousness to be a necessity for learning to occur. Richard Smith performed much research on consciousness and foreign language learning, and his research was published as many different articles. This article by him in particular discusses how attention is required in order to learn new information and how it is virtually impossible to learn without attention and consciousness. He noticed in his experiments that a lower level of consciousness results in less retained information. In terms of subliminal learning, a subject cannot retain much information through their sleep. During sleep, there is an extremely low level of consciousness, and because of this, information cannot be absorbed, let alone retained. Therefore, any information that a person would learn through an educational learning soundtrack while asleep will not be retained. Pavlovsky and Lynn's study indicated that cognition, emotion, and languages interact with each other. Although much of their study focused on this connection, they were sure to mention that they tested whether or not language is a conscious function, and they came up with the conclusion that language is a conscious function that requires attention. Learning a new language, therefore, is also a conscious function that requires attention. This article mentions, similar to all the previous articles, that consciousness and attention are necessary for learning a new language. Subliminal learning occurs unconsciously with little to no attention. Therefore, it would be extremely hard to improve pronunciation skills and new words through listening to a soundtrack while asleep. Before I present the next slide, I will provide two definitions for you that relate to the upcoming slide. Implicit learning/memory is a form of learning and memory that occurs without person's awareness, while explicit learning is a form of learning and memory that occurs with the person's awareness. Lichman hypothesized that children learn foreign languages through implicit learning and adults through explicit learning. To test this, he performed an experiment where children and adults were randomly assigned to implicit and explicit learning groups. The conclusion of the experiment indicated that those who were in the implicit learning group could not follow instructions or grammar rules, while those that were in the explicit learning group did not have difficulty following instruction or grammar rules. Similar to subliminal learning, implicit learning results in a lack of information actually learned because it is taught while the subject is unconsciously learning. Opposed to this, explicit learning, which is conscious learning, results in more retained information and correct grammar in terms of language learning. Kawakami and Yoshida's study wanted to test the effects of two different stimuli on implicit and explicit attitudes. These stimuli were either subliminal or subliminal. After using GNAT to expose participants to a randomly assigned stimulus, they came up with the conclusion. The results of the experiment indicated that subliminal stimuli affect both implicit and explicit attitudes, while subliminal stimuli affect only implicit attitudes. In terms of subliminal learning, this means that subliminal learning might affect implicit learning of a person, but in order to learn something such as a foreign language, explicit learning is required. Subliminal stimuli can influence explicit learning, but subliminal stimuli cannot. To summarize, attention and consciousness are two important things that are absolutely necessary for learning new information. It is not possible to learn something, for example, a new language, without giving the topic attention and being conscious while learning it. Therefore, the claim that listening to a foreign language at a low volume while asleep can improve a person's pronunciation, listening, and learning skills in that particular language is extremely misleading, as this is not possible without attention or consciousness. Sleeping with an educational soundtrack running will not result in you waking up with the ability to speak a new language. Thank you for watching. These are my references.